Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. Today we begin a powerful and sobering three-part series tracking the tragic story of Child Zeta, a young man described by professionals as bright, stylish and emotionally intelligent, but whose life ended in brutal and preventable circumstances. As some listeners may be aware, my career has involved participating in serious case reviews. Whilst important work, sadly, the nature of the work often involves the examination of tragedy and in some cases resulting in the conclusion that they were preventable. This case is deeply saddening, and I just want to make listeners aware that we will be discussing aspects of this case which may be distressing. So, Sarah, what are we exploring in the first podcast?
Well, in this episode, Sam, we're exploring Child Zeta's background and the escalation of risk that led to his exploitation. And while this is not an easy story to hear, it does offer vital learning for anyone working with vulnerable young people in education or social care, policing, youth justice or health.
Yeah, Zeta's story begins in 2009 when he arrived in the UK aged just 3. He was one of 4 siblings in a Muslim refugee family who had fled conflict. His mother had been a practicing doctor in her home country, but her qualifications weren't recognised in the UK. She couldn't work in her profession and the family were placed on benefits.
Yeah, they settled in Brighton in a small, overcrowded 3-bedroom flat. Zeta shared a bedroom with his 2 brothers. His father joined the family 3 years later in 2012, but the economic pressures remained, they really remained relentless. His mother's inability to work in her field was a source of frustration and hardship. And in many ways, that sort of disempowerment filtered into the family dynamic.
Professionals who came into contact with Zeta had very different, conflicting assessments of him. Some saw a young man who was engaging, funny, even charming. Others, particularly the police, described him as defiant and aggressive. This duality is important. It reveals just how differently children can present depending on context, trust, and how they are perceived by authority figures.
And so by the age of 13, Zeta was using cannabis. His vulnerabilities, poverty, emotional strain, overcrowding made him a really easy target for exploitation. His first known exploiter was someone he looked up to, an older male who shared his cultural background. He built trust through casual meetups, friendships, and the promise of belonging. But soon this relationship shifted, and that trust was weaponized.
So what started as companionship became coercion, and Zeta was groomed into dealing cannabis. Within months, he was drawn into county lines operations involving Class A drugs. The grooming was calculated. Exploiters used status, money and emotional manipulation to gain control, and soon Zeta was facing not just risk, but real danger.
And we also have to look at the emotional and cultural pressures. He wanted to support his family financially. In his eyes, this wasn't about crime, it was about contribution. But the shame and tension it created at home were huge. His mother and older brother were heartbroken. They knew he was being exploited. They begged agencies to remove him from Brighton to find a safe placement elsewhere.
And yet, over 200 police records documented the risks Zeta faced. There were missing person episodes, arrests, reports of cuckooed addresses. And cuckooing is a term that's used where vulnerable people they're exploited by drug dealers who use or live at their properties to deal drugs. And there were repeated safeguarding referrals, but the system responded too slowly, and in some cases, not at all. He remained trapped in a cycle of exploitation, even as the signs of abuse through exploitation grew more urgent.
And that escalation of harm was deeply troubling. He was stabbed in November 2022, a clear warning from his exploiters. He was arrested for serious offences, including robbery and suspected kidnap. There were indicators he had begun to exploit others himself, likely under coercion.
But then came a glimmer of hope. In early 2023, Zeta was placed in semi-independent accommodation out of area. He began to re-engage with education. He passed his GCSEs. He enrolled in college to study law and business. And he connected with youth justice workers and began talking positively about his future.
And perhaps most importantly, he started to rebuild trust with his family. There were signs that he wanted to change, that he believed he could change, but the danger was never far behind. In September 2023, he was reportedly surrounded by a group intent on harming him. He was spared only because he was with his mother.
And then in October 2023, Zeta was due in court on serious charges. Despite his history, the court was held in Brighton, his home city, and the base of his exploiters. His parents weren't told. Zeta had asked for privacy. No special measures were put in place.
And that day, after leaving court alone, Zeta was stabbed to death on a Brighton street. The attack was linked to a substantial, unresolved drug debt.
His death was preventable. His case was complex, yes, but not unique. And that's the most sobering part. There are children like Zeta in every town and city in the UK. Vulnerable, caught in systems that don't always protect them, and struggling to escape an exploitative grip they didn't choose.
So Zeta's life and death demands reflection. It demands change, because this wasn't just a young man who made bad choices. He was a child, exploited, failed.
So join us in episode 2 as we explore one of this case's most urgent learning points, knife crime as a safeguarding issue, and what we must do differently to address the fear, trauma and desperation that lead children to carry weapons.